Richard Edelman, the founder of the world's largest public relations firm, once said that public relations is based on truth, trust, and transparency. Another quote attributed to Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, was, "If I were down to my last penny, I would invest it on PR." But what are the truth and the myths of this industry, and what is its future? To find out about that, we have interviewed two of Europe's best researchers on this field. Join me. Let's go. First one is Anna Adi. Hi, Anna.
Hi,
Hello.
Sebastian.
So Anna, she's a professor doctor. She obtained her PhD from the University of West Scotland. She's now a professor of public relations and corporate communications at Quadriga University of Applied Science in Berlin, where we were kindly invited to record one of your podcasts with the Wolf Camp during the German election. So thanks for that.
That's right. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. But before that, you had an amazing career. You worked, lived, and studied in the USA under a Fulbright scholarship, but also in Belgium, in Bahrain, Thailand, and the UK. On top of that, you are the chair of the Digital Communication Awards in Berlin since 2015, and a member of the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission since 2018. Have I got it right?
Yes, that's right. So we were wondering, right, when we've met with your next guest. Now we figured it all out. So 2018, that's correct. There are topics that are very related in a sense to what I research and what I'm very interested in. So measurement and evaluation, I think it's at the core of successful public relations. But my international experience has also taught me that we underestimate and undervalue culture. And so this is one of the other things that comes into a lot of my research and teaching. Thanks for having me today.
Of course, my pleasure. I will now introduce you to Thomas Stoeckle. He comes from the private sector. He has a strong private sector background, and I will pick up on his Twitter bio, which I found it hilarious. Mm-hmm. And he's a passionately European, which is what our community is about. Outspoken introvert, we'll see about that now. Curious about how we tick, humble about how little I know. And he's the host of the Small Data Forum podcast, and he's currently a lecturer at the Quadriga University of Applied Science, where he teaches he's pursuing the political communications PhD, and he teaches on a broad range of topics where he brings his private background, or his background in the private sector. Welcome, Thomas, to our episode.
Thank you, Sebastian, and hi, Anna. Good to see you again.
Very good to see you too.
Not that we don't see each other regularly on Zoom.
That's quite right.
Sebastian, my main academic focus currently, the PhD in political communication, and most of my lecturing is at Bournemouth University in the UK, and then occasionally I do some lecturing at Quadriga pre-pandemic. That was in Berlin in person, and well, this year it was online, which was great fun, but not really the same thing. So I'm originally from Germany. I've lived in the UK for 21 years in London, and you can guess where the passionately European thing comes from. So 2016 is continuing to creating deep marks in my psychology. I was a PhD student before in Germany. I studied, I was very much focused on understanding public opinion and discourse around high-risk technology. This goes back a long way, but it links to, of course, what's happening now with public opinion and the pandemic and the role of the media, fake news and everything. So I worked for about 20 years in media intelligence in various roles, and have now gone back more into academia. But what really interests me is when you have these two Venn diagrams, one for practice and one for academia, the bit where they meet, that's where my real interest lies. That's where I'm trying to bring sort of, my two main interests and experience over the years to bear, and develop, better concepts and better models for teaching public communication, but then also how it's going to be applied in practice. And both Anna and I share that passion and work on it together as often as we can.
Yeah, I mean, we're so grateful to have you and to talk about the topic that you've been putting a lot of thought into, which is public relations. I started with a quote that you've probably come across from Bill Gates, but I've got just to start landing onto this topic. Our community is formed by members by professionals in the public affairs, communications, campaign industry, but still there is this type of myth around what public relations actually entail. And I found two quotes which perhaps show the two sides of the same coin, perhaps. And I want to hear your thoughts on them, and then we will talk a little bit more about what's coming up, what's the future of public relations. So I have the first one from John D. Rockefeller, who was considered the wealthiest American of all time. He said, next to doing the right thing, the most important thing is to let people know you are doing the right thing. And so we land here on the first concept around public relations. No, it's probably like more something loable to do, and it's the right thing to do, of course. After you have done the thing that is considered to be the right one, you communicate and you let everyone know what you have done. But first, you do the right thing. The other quote, however, I am too Americanized this morning. I don't know why, but I found it from the 60th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and he said, "What kills a skunk is the publicity it gives itself," which is, of course, is more on a more funny. So there you go. I think those are probably two competing theories about public relations, but I would like to hear from you. What's your approach? What's your, how you see public relations as a field of study, but also as a field of to practitioner, no, to exercise, not only to study. Anna?
Oof, easy answers to tricky questions. First, your American experience is not singular. A lot of the history of public relations in particular is very North American. Part of it is due to the fact that the first efforts to put together a history of public relations comes from North America. The other is that the frequency of publication is much higher coming from North America. So in a sense, it's like entering a library, and the choices that you have in a sense give you this idea of what the main discourse would be. And so they happen to be North American or American, like US American, and therefore these are where your views are. Now going back to the two quotes that you gave us, they do go to the core of what Thomas and I more and more call persuasive communication, so persuasive public communication, where one recognizes the tool, so the necessity of building awareness for something that is being done, awareness in a sense and recognition into the minds and hearts of a counterpart, so someone you talk to with or you want to know about you. The other is probably the aspect that most people would like to shun away that do work in corporate communications or in public affairs, and that is the publicity aspect. And there's a lot of history there. A lot of scholars have associated publicity in particular with P.T. Barnum, for instance, as well as in the United States, right? The gentleman who has ensured that a traveling circus would have people joining its shows. And it is notoriously known for doing whatever was possible so that people would come, right? And so that includes, cheating, lying, shocking. And so that stigma for publicity of not being so fair, so transparent, so honest has been maintained and transmitted. And it's now turned into, such a dirty word. Public relations, in a sense, to go back to what your question is, what we want to establish is persuasive communication. And it's organized in the sense that both organizations, institutions, and even associations in the public, right, can determine for themselves that they want to convince others to hear their part and possibly react, so behave in a certain way. And in this sense, it is organized because, they use research and they come up with strategies and they have tactics to make that happen. But one of the other things that Thomas and I do insist upon is that any sort of communication that has the advantage of getting itself organized needs to be accountable and has responsibility. And so more and more what Thomas and I have been advocating for is the recognition that communication has long-term effects, and therefore whoever is involved in this exercise, if you want to call it like that, needs to understand that what they do is not only something that stays for tomorrow, but rather it has long-term effects that they need to live up to and assume them for themselves. So I hope that clarifies a little bit, what you were asking us. Thomas, what do you think? Anything to add?
So
take it away, Thomas.
You've said it all. I go off and have a coffee now. One of my hobby horses in all of this is the history of the field, in a way, a history of public communication, if you want. And Sebastian, when you quote John D. Rockefeller at me, then my with relation to public relation, then my instant reaction is, oh, Ivy Lee, who was John D. Rockefeller's publicity man in the late 1900s, and then in the late 1800s and then early 1900s. And there are two people who are seen as the sort of the fathers of public relation, and one of them is this gentleman Ivy Ledbetter Lee, who was John D. Rockefeller's publicity man, and the other one is Edward Bernays, who most people know as the father of PR. They worked sort of in parallel. They didn't know each other too well. What's interesting about Lee, without spending too much time on the history there, is also that he became, in the 1920s, he became an advisor to a Dr. Joseph Goebbels in Germany, and got invited by IG Farben to advise them on public relations. As we say, the rest is history. And Ivy Lee isn't remembered so well in the history books of public relations. So that's to John D. Rockefeller. And then another quote that you mentioned at the beginning about Bill Gates, and if he had $1, he would spend it on public relations. I'll give you another quote from a gentleman called John Wanamaker, who's seen as one of the first big marketing folks. And his quote, whether he actually said it or not, I don't know, nobody does. But his quote is, "I know that 50% of my advertising investment works. I just don't know which one." So this is forever fascinating, and will forever keep people like me in the job, who deal with data and numbers and trying to figure out how we can find signals in the noise and get better at understanding what's happening next. Whilst at the same time, we know we will never fully understand any of this. My interest in the history of PR is also closely related to psychology and social psychology, and looking at how the practice of PR was carried out in the early 1900s by Edward Bernays, who happened to be the nephew of Sigmund Freud, but that's another long story.
Yeah.
This is where this is where all this stuff comes from. And then when I look at how PR is being practiced today, the same social psychological principles still apply. We haven't evolved that much. Technologically, we have evolved enormously. We now have social media and everything is fragmented. But we go back to the same principles. Anna mentioned persuasive communication. I had a class yesterday with students where I said, well, what I'm teaching you right now has the label PR, but we could also call it public communication. Some people call the marketing communication, look at the marketing communications mix. And what I'm really interested in is two aspects. The first is communication with a purpose, and the second one is persuasion. So purposive, persuasive communication is what I'm interested in. That can be good. It can be used for good, or it could be used for bad. But that's ultimately the space that we're operating in, and what we're trying to figure out. All that work that Anna and I have been doing together over the last few years, and inviting people to contribute to our Future of Communication edition at the SHS journal, goes down to figuring out how we can get better at defining in the best possible way, and then also teaching in the best possible way what this purposive, persuasive communication thing is actually meant to mean. How do we do this in a way that improves from where we have been and where we are? And looking at the pandemic and some of the things that have gone wrong in public communication, in political communication, we can analyze that. We know where some of the problems come from. We get leaders in the field of public communication, such as Richard Edelman, standing up and saying, the social contract is broken, we need a new social contract, and therefore, and one of his conclusions then is, and therefore companies need to become their own media companies. Okay, so that's an interesting approach, and I think we should discuss that a little bit more. This is just my starter for 10. So we need to see the field of communication, I think, in a more rounded way than we have done. We mustn't forget the past of the field and how it's related to today. And then we need to come up with the right formula. Formula is actually the wrong word. It should be plural. It should be formulae, because there need to be several ones that we need to be able to operate in parallel. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So let's see how far we get today.
Well, I think that was really good introduction to the topic and the discussion that we're gonna be having today. But one of the things that we love at the European Campaign Playbook is actually to have these, these 2-3 insights from you who you are on the front line of research. You teach this to new students. You probably also engage in consulting with clients in the field of PR. And what we would like to hear from you today, and what we would like this playbook to be about, is what are the key trends that you see in the field of PR in the future. And it can be like you said, it can be from how the field is actually taught at the university, but also what you see out there, what changes are already happening in the industry. So I would like to give the floor maybe to Anna now, and we can start the discussion and exchange the our impressions about that. I would also be happy to share some best practices or some things that I've seen whilst working with other campaigners, with other communication professionals, especially here in Brussels, where PR public relations is quite it should be a more prominent topic, but we are slowly getting there. Anna, please take it away.
Well, there are two different things. I mean, Thomas and I are trying to have this sort of imagination exercise of how the public relations of the future should look like and what we should consider. And in doing that, we are having multiple conversations, both with practitioners and educators and academics, to see how that sounds with them. And then there are things obviously on the other side that we notice that are coming up as being what you would qualify as trends, so something that comes more often into these conversations and into this research. So going back to your question, there are several changes that we've noticed quite prominently in research. One is when it comes to history, that we're moving away from a single chronological presentation, sort of a single truth and origin. And so in this sense, we see more approaches to historiography. So how is history made and who is making it? Questioning the roots of those stories, as well as the person who's telling that sort of story. And therefore trying to put the history of public relations in its context. So in this sense, there's plenty now of research coming out of other areas and regions. So not only the United States as a contestation, if you want, as a challenging approach to this fathers of public relations, the heir of Sigmund Freud and the good friends of Goebbels.
Would you, for example, say that there is a growing field of research being done by Europeans in Europe with probably with distinct features, or is it still the field like too Americanized?
No.
Okay.
Not at all. I mean, the field of public relations research is very active. There are several journals now that are very specific, so academic journals, if that's what you're looking into. And there are way more others. So there are about 7 public relations journals with this name per se. And then there are many, many others that under the title of communications or marketing communications or, political communication would touch upon the field, and they go to the root of what is public relations there for, who benefits from this exercise, and how happy are we as humans, as societies with this, going in a sense back to the fact that with persuasive communication that is organized, so that we can identify that someone puts an effort in it, has means, whether it's financial or people, that there's an uneasiness to it. And so there's this question of, look, am I being manipulated? Am I being lied to? Or is this something that I truly believe in and support? So no, there is not only European research, there is a very strong up and coming African school, for instance. And there are differences within Africa. There's also a great effort coming to have research on public relations from Asia, with probably a much stronger Chinese contingent than Southeast Asian, and it's there where you see these influences of the core and of the frequency, of the 80s and models and proposals of history, and then the contestation of that. So that doesn't really work for us. We don't really like this. How do we go about this?
So that's. Of course, what Anna is saying is all is all correct, and that is all happening, and it's encouraging. The point is that I think we still have centers of power, if you want, and influence when it comes to the field that are very much skewed to Western thinking, that are still, in a sense, more skewed to the US than to Europe, but they're clearly English language focused. And then we also have something that's this weird phenomenon, weird as in an acronym for WEIRD, Western educated, rich, industrialized, and democratic nations that pretty much dominate the discourse. So yes, there's a lot happening. There's a lot coming out of Africa. We need to look at Asia more, in a sense, if we want to become more inclusive. So we need to get a better understanding of China. In sheer volumes, we're looking at countries with populations of more than 1 billion people in China. In India, we look at Southeast Asia and how is that coming up. So I think the field as such needs to figure out how it can not just talk about becoming more inclusive, but actually doing it. Yeah. And then there's an ongoing diversity issue. We just need to look at the gender split in public relations organizations, and on the lower ranks of executive roles, there are many more women. On the higher ranks, there are many more men. So that's an issue. that I think we need to continue to address. One trend I want to mention very briefly is an announcement that was made by Tesla, in fact by Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, last year, where he said, well, in a tweet, because that's how he communicates, he said, well, we are going to disband our PR operations, which created a huge reaction and backlash almost in the industry by PR practitioners, of course, because they see their field undermined by journalists. And there was a lot of misunderstanding going on in that, because in fact what Elon Musk and what Tesla eliminated was the media relations function within the organization. He said there's no value in this any longer. What they have not eliminated is the investor relations function, talking to shareholders and making sure that the commercial side of communication works properly. There is also, Tesla perfectly understand how critical communication is for them as an organization. It's just a matter of how they execute that is evolving, is changing, and they just put down a very disruptive stand and also made a public statement that I think was slightly misread. What's your take on that, Anna?
It goes back to our research, doesn't it? And some of the stuff that I do with our students here at Quadriga. When we meet with them for the first course, I get them to fill a meme, a public relations meme, right? So, and it had 6 little boxes and that goes around topics like what I think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what my boss thinks I do, what I really do, right? And so what we're trying in a very playful way is to identify sort of this gap between aspiration and self-perception, but as well as reflected perception, so what others think about ourselves. And there's a great disconnect between what people say they do, which is usually very tactical. I answer to emails all day long, or I try to, herd a bunch of cats, which presents public relations, this facilitator, pampering function. And the aspiration that communicators have to be facilitators, licensed, if you want, facilitators of negotiation. So they want to be part of this conversation because they have the research, they have the understanding of what goes on around them. So going back to what Thomas has said, there's a great disconnect. Part of it is also historically inherited between what we understand public relations to be, which is mainly media relations, and what public relations practitioners themselves and the industry that has evolved around public relations wants itself to be, which is, which wants to facilitate this negotiation with stakeholder environments. There's no way to say it easier, right? So you want to you assume the fact that you have values, that you're supporting themselves, and then you actively want to promote them around your communities, but in a way that also soaks in, understands, listens, and reacts to in a meaningful way to both positive and negative feedback. So as a trend, if we go back to that, we see continuously this disconnect growing, and this disconnect, as long as it perpetuates, so it remains there, it brings loads of problems. Once, it's about self-worth. The other is about what the others understand about us. So our suggestion has been to take comms and to sort of demystify, if you want, explain what goes into persuasive communication at a much, much earlier stage and at the much wider area, right? So instead of just focusing on teaching public relations and public relations schools at university level, we actually should talk about hand in hand about media literacy and public relations literacy with much younger audiences, regardless of their specialism. And equally, we should talk about these aspects of literacy, persuasive communication, to other academic specialisms. So that includes STEM, that includes science. And it's not only, so let's go back, public relations is not only about media relations, it's about communicating, in a sense, values endorsed to others, and you need to understand that there's responsibility that comes to that. Equally, you need to understand that there's a process through which convincing happens, right? And it doesn't have to be all dirty. It's a very sincere, both Thomas and I are passionate about what we do. That doesn't necessarily mean, that we're manipulating you or brainwashing you into believe what we believe in.
Just quickly responding to Anna's point, and also I mentioned at the beginning that I'm really interested in where practice and academia sort of overlap. So when I then look at the theorizing and the abstracting of where we are on the one hand, and learning from and instructing the real world on the other hand, and people talk about these concepts of the social contract and the license to operate. Now, my question then is, social contract, okay, so who ratifies that social contract? How do we go about that? And on the side of license to operate, who grants those licenses? To give you one example of public opinion, so this morning I was listening to BBC Breakfast in that hotel I was staying in. It was running. Normally I don't, so I was just watching this, and so I saw and I'm going to be a little bit flippant now, so forgive me for that. The UK minister for deflecting questions was on television, and of course that could have been any UK minister. So there he was in his office. It was 7:30 in the morning. He was wearing a dark suit and tie. He looked very formal. Left and right of him were Union Jacks, and he was being asked questions by the BBC breakfast hosts. And it was to do with COVID and things that aren't going right in the country right now. And there he was, deflecting those questions, not really answering them. And it was all about, I was looking at that and thinking, I understand what's going on here. It's a ritual, it's symbolic communication, but this guy is representing the public communication on behalf of the government. So what if I take this now and sit down with students and discuss this in a very practical sense? Where do I start, and where does that lead me to? And how am I going to avoid, in doing that, not falling into the trap of becoming a left, liberal, quasi-moral, imperative-focused teacher who says, this is wrong and the practice must be doing something different and we must be more inclusive? What gives me the right to take that position and to decide what's right and wrong in that game? And I do struggle with that sometimes, and I do want to find better answers that work better in this space. I think it's significant. I think we need to take political communicators seriously. When we look at the White House, now we have in Jen Psaki, we have somebody who's, to all intents and purposes, for my judgment, she is very professional. She is politically partisan because she represents an organization. She's professional. Before her, we had somebody called Kelly McInerney, who filled exactly the same role that Jen Psaki does now. I have a different view of her. How do I reconcile that, and how do I really make sense of that? I struggle sometimes. I mean, I know where my beliefs are, but to translate that into something that I feel I can actually defensively teach people to go out in the world with a clearer understanding, better media literacy, better civic literacy, is not an easy undertaking.
And one of the things, though, that we've been trying to do, and this is one of the solutions, in a sense, that we found out, and it resonates with what others are also saying, is that we need to acknowledge the fact that the public relations service, if you want, is not a service, but that the public relations exercise within any sort of organization cannot be devoid from the individual values, right? We've, for so long, in that history that you've presented at the beginning of our conversation, public relations has been presented as this neutral individual or neutral department that was, so to themselves, that was highly servile, and servant to the organization. And so what we're saying is that in this day and age, when we talk so much about our own values, of finding our own purpose, we cannot simply split the individual for what they're doing. And so there are several things that we've said is necessary, is that when we start to teach about what is good and right in public relations, we start asking people what is good and right for them, to try to identify what their boundaries are. And we're not the only ones who, when we approach public relations ethics, we start with personal values and we discuss what those are. And then what we do, and what I do, and I try to do in my teaching at least, is to try to challenge practitioners and students to consider how those values are reflected into the organizations that they work with, and how far are they willing to fight for those boundaries. Now, that's all fine and dandy, right? Because that would mean that if that is being achieved, then our students and practitioners are going to find well-being at work, right? And are going to find fulfillment at work, finding either a home or a challenge that is reflective to them. The problem, though, that we're still left with is that if we join organizations that we like and that are sort of our reflections, what we tend to do then, we create bubbles around us, right? Values-based bubbles. And these bubbles will harden, because the more comfortable we are, the more we're not going to want to leave our comfort zones. And this is where Thomas and I have had multiple conversations and said, well, public relations, again, historically has said that they want to make the world sort of a better place, right? Communicate, negotiate. And so public relations has given themselves a mandate to break these boundaries and bubbles. So what we need to ensure is that by talking about responsibility and accountability, is that we remind the individual practitioner that while it is all wonderful that you reflect on your own values, that you reflect on how that is reflected on the organization, you also think of the long term. And therefore that from once in a while you think of how do you break that bubble, right? And so what we were saying is that one of the things that we need to probably change, we'd like to see changing, is that public relations is not understood as a servant to the organization, as it's been through this media relations lens, but rather as considering the social benefit, right? And if we do that, if you have someone in every room when decisions are being taken saying, okay, but in the long term, what is this gonna do to us, to my neighbors, to, I don't know, the squirrels in the park, if that's what you're curious about. That even that question, as simple as it is, potentially uncomfortable, that would lead to a different sort of conversation. So acknowledge, yes, you do have your own values. Yes, you can align them with the organization, and then obviously each and one of us have boundaries to play with, but think of the long term and think of sort of the world that you want to leave behind you. And in that sense, then ask the difficult questions that come out of that.
Perfect. So I would like to end on that positive note and a call for, in the end, it's individual responsibility and individual ethics. I firmly believe that when we step into our office or our organization, we are still individuals. So we are not magically transformed into corporate machines. And I do believe that more ethics, perhaps this is a topic for the future. We can talk about ethics in our industries. I mean, I work in campaigns. I cannot be, I could be like guilty as charged. But I do believe in the power of ethics to at least avoid the most, the worst scenarios where you're really, you are not doing the right thing, and you're clearly not even making a service to your own organization. It's probably counterproductive sometimes. Thank you very much, Anna, Thomas. I really enjoyed this chat. One of the things we like to do is to bring people, of course, practitioners, but also people who are studying the field on a more systematic way. And I think you brought us like this structure, no? And we really value that. I hope everyone enjoys this episode, and I hope to see you in Berlin or in Brussels or anywhere in Europe very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian, for having us. Thank you.
You were on mute, Thomas. So,
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
okay, thank you very much.